Marcus drove north from JFK in a rental car on October 23rd, 2024. 7 months later, on June 15th, 2025, he made the same drive again. But this drive was different. This drive was not from the airport. This drive was from the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where he had just finished testifying in the appeals hearing, where he had been asked to recount his story one more time, to confirm that what had happened at Lane 4 was what he had said had happened, to ensure that the appeals court understood that the victim of the discrimination was still standing, was still willing to testify, was still committed to the truth. The drive north took 4 hours. The highway was full of the specific quality of June afternoon light, the angle of it warm and direct, the way it caught the summer growth on the trees along the median. He had the radio playing something he did not register. His hands were on the wheel. His mind was focused on the fact that he was going home, that the legal process was almost finished, that he could finally truly move on. He pulled off at a rest stop and called Lily. Lily answered on the second ring. She was 9 years old now. She was in the 3rd grade. She was drawing pictures of things she was interested in: space explorers, underwater creatures, horses that could fly. She was becoming her own person, separate from Marcus, developing her own interests and passions and dreams. "Hi, Daddy," she said when she answered. "Are you home yet?" "I'm about 2 hours away," Marcus said. "I'll be there before dinner." "Good," Lily said. "Mrs. Holt is making something special. She won't tell me what it is, but she said it's your favorite." "Mrs. Holt is very kind," Marcus said. "She is," Lily said, "but I like it better when you're home and she can just be a neighbor again." Marcus smiled. He was thinking about the past 2 years, the investigation, the trial, the appeals. He was thinking about the fact that Lily had grown up during this process, that she had watched him testify, that she understood, in some way, that 7-year-olds should not have to understand, what it meant when someone had treated her father unfairly. "I'm home now," Marcus said. "The legal part is done. We're going to move forward." "Does that mean the drawing comes off the refrigerator?" Lily asked. Marcus paused. He had not thought about this. The drawing had been on the refrigerator for almost 2 years. The word home had been spelled out in letter magnets underneath it. It had become part of the house, part of the daily experience of coming home, part of the visual reminder of what mattered. "Do you want it to come off?" Marcus asked. "No," Lily said. "I like it there. I like seeing it every time I go to the kitchen. It reminds me." "Reminds you of what?" Marcus asked. "That you came home," Lily said. "That you kept your promise." Marcus pulled into his driveway at 6:15 p.m. The sun was still high in the sky. The grass was green. The house looked exactly the way it looked every day when he came home now. Familiar, safe. The place where he lived with his daughter. He went inside. Lily was in the kitchen with Mrs. Holt. They were making pasta, Lily's favorite, with the sauce that Mrs. Holt made from fresh tomatoes and garlic and basil from her garden. Lily ran to him and hugged him. "Mrs. Holt smiled and said, "Welcome home, Marcus." "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Marcus said. "Thank you for everything." After dinner, after Lily had been put to bed, though again she had resisted sleep, had wanted to stay awake with Marcus, had eventually fallen asleep on the couch next to him, Marcus sat alone in his living room. He looked at the flag in its frame, still hanging above the bookshelf, still the flag that the ambassador had given him, still the symbol of the mission that had been completed and the promise that had been kept. He looked at the refrigerator. The drawing was still there. the astronaut was still reaching for the stars. The word home was still spelled out underneath it. Marcus thought about the past 2 years. He thought about the moment at Lane 4. He thought about the secondary screening. He thought about Arthur Grady's conviction and the appeals process and the settlements that had come from the opened investigation. He thought about the fact that his testimony had mattered, that his willingness to tell the truth had opened a door that had forced the system to confront what it had been allowing to happen. He thought about the larger system, the system that had allowed discrimination to continue for 5 years. The system that had treated discrimination as an acceptable cost of doing business. He thought about the fact that the conviction of Arthur Grady had not ended that system, had not transformed it, had simply held one person accountable and forced the machinery to begin, slowly, to change. He thought about Lily. He thought about the promise he had made, that he would come home for her birthday. He thought about the promise he had kept, multiple times now, through the investigation, through the trial, through the appeals process. He thought about what it meant to be a father in the aftermath of something that had tried to deny him his position, his credibility, his right to exist in the space he occupied. Marcus stood up. He turned off the lights. He went upstairs to check on Lily. She was sleeping peacefully, her breathing even, her hand tucked under her pillow, the way she had slept since she was an infant. He touched her hair gently. He did not wake her. He simply stood there for a moment, acknowledging the fact that he was here, that he was home, that the mission was complete. Arthur Grady entered federal custody at FCI Otisville, Dauphin, New York, on August 14th, 2025, 4 weeks after his final appeal was denied. He is in the minimum security unit. His first parole review will take place in 2028. He does not follow the news anymore. He does not read the press releases or the updates about the cases that were reopened because of his actions. He is thinking about other things. He is thinking about a drawing, a crayon astronaut on construction paper, a 7-year-old girl's understanding of exploration and space. He keeps thinking about the drawing. He does not understand why he keeps thinking about it, but he keeps thinking about it. Carlos Mendez carries a new blue notebook now. He bought it the week he was promoted to training coordinator. He has 27 entries so far, all dated and timed and specific. He carries it in his left breast pocket, which is where the old one was. He teaches new officers about the difference between security and discrimination. He teaches them about the importance of documentation. He teaches them that a person with a pen and a notebook can change what happens next. He does not think of himself as doing anything extraordinary. He is just keeping the record, the way someone needs to. Marcus Reeves came home from Tehran carrying an ambassador's flag, a daughter's drawing, and a sealed envelope that 3 people's lives depended on. He came home through a customs counter staffed by a man who had already decided what he was. He stood in a holding room for 4 hours. He picked up a drawing from a concrete floor and put it in his pocket. He testified in federal court. He watched a man be convicted. He drove 4 hours north to a 9-year-old who had been waiting on a front porch every morning of his deployment, asking if he was coming home. That is what the 72 hours looked like from the outside, from the inside. It was simpler than that. A man who had a promise to keep, who kept it. The rest was just what was in the way. And what was in the way was a system. And the system had to change. And it did. Not all the way, not completely, not perfectly, but it changed. Because one person told the truth. Because one person kept a record. Because one person kept a promise. And because a 7-year-old girl knew that her father would come home because he said he would. The drawing is still on the refrigerator. The word home is still spelled out underneath it. The flag is still hanging in the living room. in its simple wooden frame, the triangle fold still perfect, the cloth still precisely aligned. These are the objects that mattered. These are the objects that got carried through fire. These are the objects that made the mission worth completing. Home.
Lane 9, Officer Arthur Grady said, without looking up from his screen. General boarding and tourists use Lane 9. The man standing at the counter did not move. He had been awake for 72 hours. He had been under mortar fire for 48 of them. He set his olive drab duffel bag on the floor, placed his documents on the counter, and waited. Arthur looked up.
JFK International Airport, Terminal 4, 3:07 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. The arrivals hall was nearly empty. A handful of delayed international travelers scattered across the concourse. 2 college students sleeping on their luggage. The low hum of ventilation that never stopped. The fluorescent lights overhead converted everything to the same flat, colorless gray. At this hour, the terminal belonged to the people who worked in it, and Arthur Grady had worked in it for 15 years. He considered it his. He looked at the man across the counter with the specific, reductive perception of someone who had already decided everything worth deciding. Tall, broad-shouldered, black, civilian clothes, polo shirt, dark jeans, worn boots, military duffel bag, the kind that looked like it had seen genuine use. The civilian clothes were the point of entry for Arthur's suspicion. Real military personnel wore their uniforms when traveling on official orders. What Arthur did not know was that not wearing the uniform was the order. What Arthur did not know was that the man in front of him had stripped his rank and insignia from a forward operating base 48 hours ago to maintain a low profile during an extraction that Arthur did not have the clearance to know about. What Arthur did not know filled the space between them.
In the duffel bag, packed carefully among the civilian clothes, was an olive drab American flag given to Marcus by the American ambassador in Tehran before the final plane lifted off. Beside it was a drawing on construction paper, a crayon astronaut in space, rendered in the specific, confident way of a 6-year-old girl who did not know exactly what her father did, but knew he went somewhere far away and came back. The astronaut had a circle for a head and a triangle for a body, and legs made of 2 careful lines.
Today was the girl's birthday. Marcus did not tell Arthur any of this. He placed his documents on the counter. "Good morning, officer. I am Sergeant First Class Marcus Reeves, United States Army. I'm returning from a classified deployment under Title 10 orders. This is the correct lane." Arthur looked at the documents. He did not pick them up. His hands stayed on the desk, fingers relaxed. The gesture of a man exercising authority he believed was unchallengeable. He studied the soldier in front of him. He studied the documents without touching them. He looked at the duffel bag, at the boots, at the tiredness that was visible in the way the man was standing, the specific tiredness of someone who had been upright through 72 hours of operations. Arthur Grady had been working the customs lane at JFK for 15 years, and in that time he had developed a very particular sense of who was supposed to use the lane reserved for returning military personnel, and who was not. It was an instinct, he would have said. It was not an instinct. It was something else. But Arthur believed in instincts, which meant he believed that what he was feeling now was trustworthy, which meant he was about to make a decision that would change the course of 4 lives and expose the machinery of his own judgment in ways he could not yet imagine.
"I'm going to need you to step to lane 9, Arthur said. He still had not picked up the documents. "That's the general lane. That's where you need to go." The sealed envelope at the bottom of the duffel bag was marked with 3 stamps, TS/SCI, Department of the Army, and a serial number that corresponded to an active extraction operation. It had not been opened. It was not supposed to be opened in any room that did not have a security clearance posted on the door. Arthur Grady had not thought about the envelope yet. He would...
48 hours before the airport. 48 hours before Lane 4 and Arthur Grady, and the moment that would change his life and define it. Marcus Reeves was moving through a logistics problem under fire, which was the kind of problem he had spent 14 years learning to solve. He was 38 years old. He had deployed 6 times. He had been to places he was not authorized to discuss by name, in circumstances he was not authorized to describe. He carried this history with the specific, careful economy of someone who had learned that the weight of it was real, but manageable. He had developed a practice for managing it that involved keeping very precise track of the things that were worth keeping track of. One of those things was a 6-year-old girl named Lily, who drew astronauts in space and whose birthday was the day he was scheduled to land at JFK. The mission was simple in conception and complex in execution. Extract 31 American diplomatic personnel and 3 families, 47 people total, from the U.S. Embassy compound in Tehran, following a rapid deterioration of the security situation. The security situation had deteriorated in the specific, predictable way that security situations deteriorate when the government controlling a region shifts suddenly and the institutions protecting American interests become, overnight, an asset to be protected rather than a location to be maintained. Marcus was an Army logistics and extraction specialist, attached to a small joint task force operating out of a forward operating base in the region. His job was to take the diplomatic personnel, the people who had trained for this contingency in much the way that pilots train for catastrophic engine failure, with the understanding that the training might never be used but must exist anyway, and move them from the compound to the airfield and onto the aircraft and into the sky in an unbroken sequence of movements that left no person behind and no critical window uncovered. He had done this before, not in Tehran, not with diplomatic personnel, not under the specific constellation of threats that surrounded this particular extraction. But he had done the essential structure of it enough times that his mind could hold the variables and process them without the processing being visible on his face. The evacuation would take 72 hours. From the moment the decision was made to the moment the last aircraft lifted off. 72 hours to move 47 people from a compound under fire to an airfield that was still technically under government control, but whose political status was becoming uncertain by the hour. 72 hours to ensure that no one was forgotten, that no critical document was left behind, that the 3 classified cases containing the intelligence operations of the past 6 years were on the aircraft when it left. The 3 cases were what the mission was actually about. The diplomatic personnel were the cover. This was not stated explicitly. It did not need to be. Marcus understood this the way you understand that you are supposed to pretend something is one way when it is clearly another way. You acknowledge it by not mentioning it. He understood that the 3 people whose lives depended on the contents of those cases, the sources, the assets, the people who had been helping American interests in the region by making themselves vulnerable to it, would be on the aircraft that carried the cases. He understood that if the cases were compromised, those 3 people would face consequences that extended beyond the end of the evacuation and into the indefinite future of their lives. He understood this because Captain Frank Kowalski, his commanding officer, had told him explicitly. The 3 names in the envelope are in the last section of the compound. They need to be on the aircraft. After they're safe, you can think about everything else. Marcus had nodded. He did not ask for the names. He did not want them. He wanted to know that they were somewhere in the 47 people he was moving, and after they were moving, he would forget them again. The first phase was evacuation of non-essential personnel, the administrative staff, the visa application specialists, the people who kept the compound running. 26 people in 4 groups, moving out at 6-hour intervals over the first 36 hours. The second phase was the diplomatic personnel, the ambassador, the charge d'affaires, the security officers. 9 people moving out in 2 groups in hour 38 through hour 48. The final phase was Marcus himself, the 3 unnamed people whose lives depended on staying alive, and the classified cases. 72 hours. Marcus had not slept in 60 of them. The remaining 12 hours of sleep, 3 hours on the first night, 6 hours on the second, 3 hours on a cot in the operations tent on the morning of the final extraction, were fragmentary and shallow in the way that sleep becomes when you are running a logistics operation under fire. Your brain does not fully disengage. It keeps processing. It keeps track of the variables. At hour 68, the mortar fire had started. The compound's location had always been known to the forces arraying against American interests. But the timing of the barrage suggested that the decision to target it had been made very recently. The compound's walls were designed to absorb this kind of fire without collapsing, but they were not designed for sustained bombardment. Marcus was in the operations center when the first rounds came in. He heard them, the specific sound of incoming fire, the sound that you learn in your first deployment and that your nervous system never fully forgets. "We're moving the final group to the airfield now," he said to Kowalski. "Aircraft lifts at hour 71. That gives us 45 minutes. Kowalski nodded. He was on the satellite phone with the ambassador in the secure location 3 blocks away. He hung up and looked at Marcus. "The ambassador says the 3 will meet you there." The 3, the unnamed people, the sources, the people who had made themselves vulnerable to American interests because they believed it was the right thing to do, and who were now going to spend the next 72 hours understanding what vulnerability actually meant. Marcus picked up the radio. He moved the final 16 people, 9 diplomatic personnel, the ambassador, and 4 contractors, to the vehicles. Elena Ortega, the junior diplomat from Consular Services, was herding her 2-year-old son into the last vehicle. The child, Diego, had been crying since they left the compound main building. Elena had the specific focus of someone who was trained for contingencies, but who was experiencing one anyway. "He'll be okay," Marcus said. "We move fast. We're in the air in 30 minutes. After that, you can help him sleep." Elena nodded. She strapped Diego into a car seat that Marcus had salvaged from somewhere in the compound. Marcus had salvaged a lot of things. Anticipating needs. She looked at Marcus with the look of someone who understood that she was in the hands of someone who had done this before. "Thank you," she said. "After we land," Marcus said. "Thank me after we land." The convoy moved through the streets of Tehran in the specific way that military convoys move when they are trying to appear to belong there. They did not rush. They did not draw attention. They moved with the confidence of people who had been moving through that geography long enough that it was becoming familiar, which was not true for any of them, which was the point of moving with confidence. The mortar fire continued in the distance. It was not directed at the convoy. It was still targeting the compound, still working on the assumption that there were Americans there to kill. The convoy reached the airfield at hour 70, 45 minutes to the scheduled liftoff of the final aircraft. The C-17 was waiting. Its engines were not yet on, but they would be. Its cargo ramp was down. Its crew was standing by, watching the convoy approach. Marcus moved the 16 people onto the aircraft. He did a head count. He did it again. He did it a 3rd time. 16. He moved to the next group. The administrative personnel who had gone out in the earlier phases were already on the aircraft. Scattered through the cargo area, the small window seats that had been installed for emergency evacuations, 31 people were already on the aircraft. He moved to the tarmac. He was waiting for the final convoy, the ambassador, the 3 unnamed people, himself. The aircraft was beginning its engine startup sequence. Marcus could feel the temperature changing, the smell of jet fuel becoming sharper, the urgency of a deadline becoming a visible thing in the way the crew was moving. The final convoy came through the gates at hour 71, 20 minutes to the scheduled liftoff. The most important moment of the evacuation was not the mortar fire, and not the crumbling tarmac. It was a moment that happened 4 minutes before the final C-17 lifted off, in the chaos of the final boarding, when the weight of the mission came down to a single, impossible choice. Elena Ortega had been calm throughout the evacuation. She was 29 years old, a junior diplomat from the consular section, and she had been trained for contingency situations in much the way that pilots are trained for catastrophic engine failure, the understanding that it might never happen, but that the training had to exist anyway. She had followed Marcus's instructions with the efficient focus of someone who knew that efficiency was how you kept people safe. She had kept Diego calm throughout the compound evacuation, had strapped him into the car seat during the convoy, had moved through the boarding process with the specific grace of someone who understood that panic was a choice. Diego had been crying since they left the compound. He was 2 years old. He did not understand evacuation or extraction, or the reasons his mother had suddenly taken him from his bed at 3 in the morning and carried him through dark hallways and put him into a strange vehicle, and was now carrying him toward an even stranger machine that was making noise so loud that it hurt. He had his stuffed bear, a small, faded brown bear with one eye loose and the other intact. The toy that he had had since he was born. The toy that was the only thing in his world that was predictable. On the tarmac, in the chaos of the final boarding, in the sound of the C-17's engines, and the distant mortar fire, and the specific urgency of a deadline that had become physical. Elena was holding Diego and moving toward the aircraft ramp. Marcus was 10 feet ahead of her. Moving the ambassador and the 2 diplomatic security officers toward the ramp. The 3 unnamed people were somewhere in the process. Marcus did not look at them, did not acknowledge them, did not allow them to become visible in his attention. Diego's stuffed bear fell from Elena's arms. It landed on the concrete tarmac 20 feet behind them. A small brown bear with one eye loose, on an airfield that was about to come under sustained fire, rolling slightly in the wind that the aircraft engines were creating. Elena heard it more than she saw it, the specific sound of something small hitting concrete. She stopped. She looked back. She looked at the bear. She looked at the aircraft. She looked at Diego, who was reaching backward, searching for the bear, beginning to cry harder. Elena started to turn back. Marcus stopped her. He put his hand on her shoulder. "I've got it. Keep moving." He went back himself. He moved back down the ramp and onto the tarmac in the specific, unhurried way of someone who had learned that panic is a choice and learned not to make it. He bent down. He picked up the bear. He did not look at the compound. He did not look at the direction the mortar fire was coming from. He picked up the bear and turned back and moved toward the aircraft. He handed it to Diego. Diego took it. The child's crying became quieter, still present, but losing the edge of panic. The bear was still there. The bear was still real. The bear was still his. Elena looked at Marcus and said one thing. "Thank you." It was the specific thank you that covered more than the bear. It covered the last 72 hours. The instructions followed without questioning. The people kept safe. The small, impossible choices made and unmade. It covered the understanding that she was in the hands of someone who understood that the war happened not in the large movements, but in the small ones. Not in the decisions that were broadcast, but in the decisions that were made without announcement, without fanfare, in the middle of fire, Marcus noted. He moved Elena and Diego onto the aircraft. He turned back to the tarmac. The ambassador and the 2 security officers were already on the ramp. The 3 unnamed people were moving up the ramp. Their faces were not Marcus's focus. Their names were not Marcus's concern. They were moving. They were about to be safe. After they were safe, Marcus could stop paying attention to them. He boarded last. The aircraft lifted off at hour 72, 17 minutes ahead of schedule. As it climbed, the city fell away, the compound becoming a shape, the airfield becoming a grid, the fire becoming something happening on a planet that was rapidly getting smaller. The C-17 climbed in the specific, powerful way that military transport aircraft climb, with the force of engineering and fuel and the understanding that what was happening below was no longer relevant to what was happening here. 10 minutes after liftoff, the ambassador made his way back through the cargo area to where Marcus was sitting. The ambassador was 63 years old, a career diplomat who had served in 7 countries and who had the specific bearing of someone who understood that authority came not from raising your voice, but from being the person who did not raise it. He sat down next to Marcus. He had something in his hands. "We did the right thing," the ambassador said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, the kind that only someone in the ambassador's position could make with the understanding that it was true. Marcus nodded. The ambassador handed Marcus a flag. It was folded into a triangle. The way that flags are folded for presentation at funerals, the way that flags are folded for ceremonies. It was the American flag that had been flying above the embassy compound until the moment they left. Someone had taken it down. Marcus did not know who, did not need to know. Someone had folded it with the respect that flags deserve. The staff voted on who should carry it, the ambassador said. It was unanimous. They wanted you to have it. Marcus took the flag. He felt the weight of it in his hands. It was heavier than a flag should be, heavier with the weight of meaning, heavier with the understanding that it represented something that had been at risk, and that was now, for the moment, safe. "Thank you, Mr. Ambassador," Marcus said. "Go home," the ambassador said. "See your daughter. Tell her that the people who got out today, all of them, they're going to have the rest of their lives because you understood how to move them through fire. Tell her that matters." The ambassador moved back through the cargo area. Marcus held the flag. He looked at the people scattered through the aircraft, the administrative staff, the diplomatic personnel, the families, the security officers. He counted them, not to check. He already knew there were 47, but to acknowledge them, to confirm that they were all there, that the 72 hours had produced the outcome it was supposed to produce. 47 people, 3 of them unnamed, all of them alive. Later, during the flight, Marcus wrapped the flag in his spare uniform shirt, the one he had been carrying in his duffel bag since deployment began. He placed it carefully into the bottom of the duffel bag, folding the uniform around it to protect it, treating it with the specificity of someone who understood that this object now carried weight beyond its material existence. He took out a pen and paper. He wrote a note to Lily. He wrote, "Dear Lily, I'm coming home. I'm bringing you something." I will be there on your birthday. Love, Dad. That was not enough. He wrote, "The people you see in your dreams, the astronauts, the explorers, the people who go to places we haven't been, they're real. They're real because people like you imagine them. Keep drawing them. Keep imagining. I'm coming home to see what you've created while I was gone." He folded the note. He put it in his pocket. He did not need to mail it. He would be there to tell her in person, but he had written it anyway. The way soldiers write letters they will never send. The way they document the journey for the person they are trying to return to. At some point during the flight, Marcus slept. His body insisted on it. He slept for 4 hours. The first real sleep he had had in 60 hours. And he dreamed of things he would not remember when he woke up. The mind's way of processing what the waking mind is not ready to process. When he woke up, he was still holding the flag, still wrapped in the uniform, still in his hands like it was something that might disappear if he looked away. 22 hours later, the C-17 landed at JFK. Arthur Grady had been working the customs lane at JFK for 15 years. Before that, he had worked for the Port Authority. And before that, he had done a stint with the NYPD. And before that, he had been in the military, though he did not talk about the military much anymore. He was 58 years old. He had been divorced twice. He had no children. What he had was authority. The authority granted by his position at the customs counter. The authority to stop people, to question them, to decide whether they were legitimate travelers or whether they were something else. Arthur had developed a very particular sense of who belonged in which lane. This was not something he had been trained to do. It was something he had developed through 15 years of looking at people's faces, at their posture, at the way they held their documents, at the specific tells that he believed indicated dishonesty or threat. It was an instinct. Arthur believed. What Arthur did not understand was that instincts are constructed. They are built from experience and assumption and prejudice woven together so tightly that it is impossible to separate them. Arthur had been promoted to supervisor 5 years ago in his new position. He oversaw 4 CBP officers and the general flow of the customs lines. His success was measured in throughput, how many people could be processed, how few red flags, how smooth the operation. He was good at it. He was very good at it. His commendations from the CBP regional office sat in a frame on his desk. His supervisor, Roy Holler, had told him that his next promotion was when, not if. Arthur believed this. Arthur believed that he had earned it. Arthur believed that his success came from his instinct, from his ability to read people, from his capacity to separate the legitimate travelers from the ones who did not belong. What Arthur did not believe was that his instinct might be compromised. What Arthur did not believe was that 15 years of looking at people's faces might have taught him to see things that were not there. The night that Marcus Reeves came through his lane was October 23rd. Arthur was coming to the end of a 14-hour shift. He was tired. He was irritable. His back hurt from standing for too long. The airport was in that strange, early morning moment when the night crowd was thinning out and the day crowd had not yet arrived. There were maybe 30 people in the entire arrivals hall, scattered across 5 active customs lanes. Marcus came to lane 4, which was Arthur's lane. Arthur looked up from his computer screen. He saw the man, tall, black, civilian clothes, military duffel bag. He saw the olive drab color of the bag. He saw the way the man was standing, the specific posture of exhaustion. He saw all of these things. and his brain made a decision about what they meant in the span of approximately 2 seconds. Arthur did not pick up the documents that Marcus had placed on the counter. This was a choice. Arthur did not acknowledge the Title 10 orders that Marcus had mentioned. This was a choice. Arthur did not process the documents that indicated Marcus's status as active military returning from a classified deployment. This was a choice. Lane 9, Arthur said, without looking up from his screen. General boarding and tourists use Lane 9. Marcus did not move. He stood very still. The way that soldiers stand when they are taking on information that does not match what they were expecting. He looked at Arthur. Arthur did not look back. Arthur was looking at his computer screen, but he was not reading anything. He was just not looking at Marcus. "Officer," Marcus said, "I am Sergeant First Class Marcus Reeves, United States Army. I'm returning from a classified deployment under Title 10 orders. This is the correct lane. These are my official documents." Arthur looked at the documents. He still did not pick them up. He looked at Marcus's face. He looked at the military duffel bag. He looked at the civilian clothes. He made another decision. The second decision. The one that would determine what happened next. "I don't believe you," Arthur said. "Those could be fake documents, and I don't like the way you're looking at me. Lane 9 is where you need to be. General processing." There was a moment, a very small moment, maybe 2 seconds long, where Marcus processed what had just been said to him. He processed the accusation that his documents were fake. He processed the accusation that his appearance was threatening. He processed the understanding that he was being sent to the general processing lane. The lane reserved for people with questionable status or insufficient documentation. The lane where he would be processed the same way that a suspected overstayer from a visa violation country would be processed. He processed all of this, and then he did something that would later become the central statement of his defense. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand to speak to a supervisor. He picked up his documents. He picked up his duffel bag. He walked to Lane 9. Lane 9 was staffed by Officer Carlos Mendez, who had been working the customs desk for 6 years and who had the specific quality of being very good at his job because he paid attention to people rather than to his assumptions about people. He was 28 years old. He had wanted to be a CBP officer since he was in high school. He believed in the work. He believed that protecting the borders of the country was work that mattered. What he also believed was that protecting the borders of the country and treating people with respect were not mutually exclusive. Carlos looked up as Marcus approached. He saw a tall, exhausted man in civilian clothes carrying a military duffel bag. He saw someone who looked like someone who had not slept for a very long time. He saw the documents that Marcus was holding. He did not immediately make assumptions about what any of this meant. He waited. Marcus placed the documents on the counter. "Morning, officer. I am Sergeant First Class Marcus Reeves, United States Army. I'm returning from a classified deployment under Title 10 orders." Carlos looked at the documents. He picked them up. He read them. He read them a second time. He looked at Marcus. "Welcome home, Sergeant," Carlos said. "Can you tell me what's in the duffel bag?" "Mostly personal effects," Marcus said. "Some items from the deployment, an olive drab flag, a drawing from my daughter, a sealed envelope marked TSSCI that I am not authorized to open outside of a secure facility." Carlos nodded. He did not ask to search the bag. He did not ask to inspect the contents. What he did do was pick up his radio. "Supervisor Holler, this is Officer Mendez at Lane 9. I have a returning service member with classified materials. I'm going to need direction on processing." The radio crackled. Roy Haller's voice came through. "Send him to secondary." Carlos looked at Marcus. I need you to come with me, Sergeant. This is just standard procedure for classified materials. Secondary processing is right this way. Marcus picked up his duffel bag. As he was walking away from Lane 9, he saw Arthur Grady standing at Lane 4, watching him. Arthur's face was readable. He was looking at Marcus with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was not regretting it. Arthur did not know, yet, that his decision had changed everything. The secondary screening room was a small, climate-controlled space, about 20 feet by 20 feet, with a single metal table and 4 plastic chairs. The walls were blank. The fluorescent lights were bright enough that they left no shadows. A security camera in the corner was recording everything, which everyone knew and which everyone chose to ignore until the moment when the recording became relevant. Marcus was brought to the room by a TSA agent named Henderson. Henderson was 63 years old, 3 years from retirement, and he had learned a very long time ago that the best way to manage classified material processing was to do it by the book and to document every step. He took Marcus's documents. He read through them. He made notes. He took a photograph of each page. He was very thorough. I'm going to do a standard inspection of the duffel bag, Henderson said. I will not open the sealed envelope. I will verify its presence and its condition. Everything else is subject to normal inspection. Is that understood? Yes, sir, Marcus said. Henderson opened the duffel bag. He went through it methodically. Civilian clothes, socks, underwear, boots, a spare uniform shirt, personal hygiene items. He found the flag wrapped in the uniform shirt, and he held it up. He did not unfold it. He simply acknowledged it and placed it on the table. This is the flag? Henderson asked. Yes, sir. It was presented to me by the ambassador. Henderson made a note. He continued through the bag. He found the drawing, the crayon astronaut on construction paper, the letters D-A-D-Y spelled out in careful crayon at the bottom. He held it up. He looked at it. For a moment, something almost human crossed his face, the recognition of what it was, what it represented, the understanding that this was not contraband or threat. This was a message from a child to a father. This is from your daughter? Henderson asked. Yes, sir, my daughter, Lily. She's 7 today. Today is her birthday. Henderson made a note of that, too. He placed the drawing on the table next to the flag. He continued through the bag. At the bottom, he found the envelope, sealed, marked TSSCI, with the Department of the Army seal, with a serial number that corresponded to an active extraction operation. This is the classified envelope? Henderson asked. Yes, sir. You have not opened it? No, sir. I understand I'm not authorized to open it outside of a secure facility. Henderson made a note. He did not touch the envelope. He simply verified its presence and its condition. When he was finished, he placed everything back in the duffel bag. The clothes, the boots, the uniform shirt, the flag, the drawing, the envelope. He closed the bag. He looked at Marcus. Everything checks out, Sergeant. You're clear to go. You can proceed through customs. Welcome home. Marcus picked up the duffel bag, but before he left the room, Henderson said something else. My daughter's birthday was last month. She's 12. She doesn't draw anymore, but she did when she was younger. I still have some of the drawings. They're on our refrigerator. Marcus nodded. He did not say anything, but he understood what Henderson was saying. Henderson was saying that the drawing mattered. Henderson was saying that he understood what was at stake, not in the geopolitical sense, not in the classified sense, but in the human sense. Henderson was saying that he recognized a father coming home to his daughter, and that he recognized that the drawing was more important than any classified material. Marcus left the secondary screening room. He passed back through lane 9, where Carlos Mendez was processing a family of tourists. Carlos looked up and gave Marcus a small nod. It was the nod of one person acknowledging another person who had just been treated badly and who was handling it with grace. Marcus nodded back. As Marcus was walking toward the exit of the customs hall, he heard Arthur Grady's voice behind him. Arthur was calling out to another officer, Officer Patterson, who worked lane 3. Arthur's voice carried across the customs hall. What Arthur said was, "Did you see him? Did you see that guy I sent to secondary? That's the kind of person you have to watch out for, military or not. Something wasn't right about that guy. And I bet you anything that when they open that bag, they're going to find something." Carlos Mendez heard this. Officer Patterson heard this. The other officers in the customs hall heard this. What they heard was Arthur Grady making a prediction, making a statement, laying down a marker that said, "If anything goes wrong, it will be because I was right about this person." But Marcus had already passed through customs. Marcus was already at the exit. Marcus was already thinking about the drive home, about the 4 hours north on the highway, about the 7-year-old girl waiting on the front porch of a house in upstate New York, about the drawing he was carrying in his duffel bag and the flag he was carrying under his arm. He did not hear what Arthur Grady said. He did not know that the seed of the accusation had already been planted. He did not know that, in the surveillance footage from the customs hall, his moment at lane 4 was being archived, was being saved, was being waiting to be reviewed at some future moment when the question would be asked, what happened at lane 4 on October 23rd at 3:22 a.m.? What happened was that Arthur Grady made a decision. What happened was that the decision was made in approximately 2 seconds. What happened was that the decision was made based on appearance and assumption and prejudice, woven together so tightly that it could not be separated. What happened was that the consequences of the decision would ripple forward, would grow, would become a case, would become a trial, would become a statement about what it means to be a man of color, returning from serving your country at the border of your country. But at that moment, at 3:22 a.m. on October 23rd, none of that was yet visible. At that moment, Arthur Grady was still standing at lane 4, still believing in his instinct, still believing that he had been right about something. At that moment, Marcus Reeves was walking out of JFK International Airport and toward a rental car and toward a home and toward a birthday that he had promised his daughter he would not miss. The customs screening room at JFK is not silent after people leave it. It is not empty. After Marcus Reeves walked out and toward the exit and toward his rental car, the room continued its work. Other travelers came through. Other bags were searched. Other documents were verified. The machinery of the border continued to function in the way that machinery functions, without commentary, without judgment, simply processing the flow of people and things. But Henderson, the TSA agent, was thinking about the drawing. He was thinking about the 7-year-old daughter. He was thinking about the way that Marcus had said, "Today is her birthday," with the specific understanding that it mattered, that it was not just a fact to be registered, but a fact that changed the meaning of everything else. At 4:17 a.m., Henderson finished his shift. He clocked out. He walked to his car in the long-term parking lot. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He was thinking about his own daughter, the one who was 12, the one who did not draw anymore. He was thinking about the drawing she had made when she was younger, the paintings and the sketches and the crayon drawings of impossible things. He made a decision. It was not a big decision. It was small. It was the kind of decision that happens in the spaces between actions. in the moments when no one is watching. He decided to do something about what he had witnessed at Lane 4. He drove home. He drank coffee. He sat at his kitchen table with his wife, who was reading the newspaper while eating breakfast. He told her about the interaction he had witnessed. He told her about Arthur Grady telling a decorated soldier to go to the general processing lane because something wasn't right about him. He told her about the classified documents, the military duffel bag, the drawing from a 7-year-old girl. His wife looked at him. "That's not right," she said. "That's not the way people should be treated." "No," Henderson said. "It's not." He picked up his phone. He made a call to the CBP regional office. He left a voicemail with the duty officer. He provided a time code, a date, a location. He described what he had witnessed. He provided the names of the officers involved. He asked for a review of the surveillance footage. And then he went about his day. He drove to his daughter's school. He attended a parent-teacher conference. He came home and made dinner. He was not thinking about the voicemail anymore. He had done what he thought needed to be done, and that was enough. What he did not know was that the voicemail would sit in the duty officer's inbox for almost 48 hours before being reviewed. What he did not know was that when it was reviewed, the first step would be to pull the surveillance footage, and the second step would be to have Supervisor Roy Holler review it, and that Roy Holler would watch the footage with the specific interest of someone who was protecting one of his officers. Roy Holler had supervised Arthur Grady for 5 years. In those 5 years, Arthur had developed an excellent record, high throughput, few red flags, consistent commendations. Roy Holler did not spend a lot of time thinking about the specific way that Arthur arrived at his conclusions. He spent time thinking about the results, which were good. He spent time thinking about the fact that Arthur had been recommended for promotion, which reflected well on his own management. When Roy Holler watched the surveillance footage of Arthur Grady at Lane 4, he watched it with the understanding that he was watching the behavior of a man he had supervised, and that the behavior was his responsibility. What he saw was Arthur Grady refusing to process the documents of a service member. What he saw was Arthur directing that service member to the general processing lane. What he saw was, if he looked closely, if he was willing to look closely, Arthur's decision being made based on something other than the documents. What he saw was a choice. Arthur Grady's choice to treat this person differently. Roy Holler did not like what he saw, but Roy Holler also did not like the position he was in. Roy Holler had supervised Arthur for 5 years. Roy Holler had commended Arthur for his work. Roy Holler had told Arthur that his promotion was when, not if. Roy Holler was now watching footage of Arthur doing something that looked, if you examined it carefully, like discrimination. Roy Holler had a choice. He could report what he had seen. He could open an investigation. He could take responsibility for the fact that he had supervised someone whose decision-making was compromised by something other than legitimate screening practices. Or he could make a different choice. Roy Holler closed the footage. He did not send a report. He did not open an investigation. He did something else instead. He called Arthur Grady. He said, "There's been a complaint about your processing of a returning service member. Nothing serious, but I'm going to need you to come into the office tomorrow morning and provide a statement about what happened at Lane 4 around 3:20 a.m. Arthur, when he took the call, felt something like satisfaction. He had known something was wrong about that soldier. He had known it from the moment he saw him. Arthur had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts had been right. And now there was a complaint, which meant there was something to investigate, which meant Arthur had been correct. What Arthur did not understand was that the complaint was not about the soldier. The complaint was about Arthur. Carlos Mendez did not make a phone call to the CBP regional office. Carlos Mendez did not speak to his supervisor. What Carlos Mendez did do was something much simpler and much more profound. He began to keep a record. The record was not official. There was no official record for what Carlos was recording. The official record existed in the surveillance footage, in the logs that the CBP kept, in the databases that documented the flow of travelers through the customs lanes. But the official record did not capture what Carlos had witnessed, did not capture the understanding that came from standing at the adjacent lane and watching Arthur Grady refuse to process the documents of a service member. Carlos bought a small notebook. It was blue. He bought it the day after the incident. He paid for it with his own money. He kept it in his left breast pocket, which was where he kept his pen, which was where officers kept things that mattered. On the first page, he wrote, October 23rd, 3:22 a.m., Lane 4, Officer Arthur Grady, Service Member SFC Marcus Reeves, returning from classified deployment, directed to Lane 9 without document review. Time code available in surveillance footage. Documents appeared legitimate. Title 10 orders. Deployment credentials. He did not know what he would do with the record. He did not have a plan. He was just keeping track. The way that someone needs to, the way that witnesses to things keep track of what they have seen. He was keeping track because not keeping track would feel like a choice to forget. And he did not want to forget. The notebook went into his left breast pocket. He carried it to work. He carried it home. He did not show it to anyone. He did not mention it. What he did do was, every time he witnessed something at the customs lanes that seemed wrong, every time he saw an officer making a decision that seemed based on something other than legitimate screening practices, he made a note of it, dated and timed and specific. By the end of 2 weeks, he had 11 notes in the notebook. By the end of a month, he had 23 notes. By the end of 2 months, he had 41 notes. All of them focused on Arthur Grady. All of them documenting a pattern of behavior that was consistent, that was visible if you were looking for it, that was systematic in the way that systems of discrimination are systematic, not random, not accidental, but patterned and repeated and consistent. Carlos Mendez was not the kind of person to act without understanding what he was acting toward. He was thoughtful. He was careful. He was someone who believed in institutions and in the processes that institutions provided. But he also understood that sometimes institutions did not work. That sometimes the processes did not produce the outcomes they were supposed to produce. That sometimes you had to be the person who documented the failure. He did not know. Yet, what he would do with the notebook. He did not know that his documentation would become critical to what happened next. He did not know that the blue notebook that he carried in his left breast pocket would eventually become Exhibit A in a federal investigation. He only knew that he could not forget what he had seen, and that the only way he could ensure that he did not forget was to write it down. He kept the record. At the CBP regional office on October 24th, the morning after Marcus came through Lane 4, a meeting was called. The meeting included Roy Holler, the CBP regional director, and a representative from the FBI. The representative from the FBI was there because of the sealed envelope, the envelope marked TS-SCI, the envelope that belonged to an active, classified operation. The envelope that had been in Marcus's duffel bag when he came through the customs lanes. The question being asked in the meeting was, what was in the envelope? The legal answer was that no one could open the envelope without a security clearance and without authorization from the Department of the Army. The practical answer was that the envelope was sitting in a secure storage facility at JFK, and that it needed to be processed, and that before it could be processed, someone needed to determine what it was and what it contained. A call was made to Captain Frank Kowalski, Marcus's commanding officer. The call was made by the FBI representative, a man named Douglas Wells, who had been involved in counterintelligence work for 17 years and who understood the world of classified material and how it moved through systems. Captain Kowalski, I am Special Agent Douglas Wells with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am calling to verify the status of an envelope marked TS-SCI that came through customs at JFK International Airport on October 23rd. The envelope is associated with a service member named Marcus Reeves, Sergeant First Class, Army Logistics and Extraction Specialist. Can you confirm the status of this envelope? There was a pause. Then Kowalski's voice came through, measured and controlled. I can confirm that SFC Reeves was assigned to carry classified materials as part of his evacuation duties. The materials are part of an active extraction operation. If the envelope is still at JFK, it needs to be transferred to a secure facility immediately. Do you have the authorization to handle classified material? I do, Wells said. What should I do with the envelope? Do not open it. Do not allow anyone without a TS-SCI clearance to handle it. Transfer it to a secure courier service. The courier service will have instructions for where to deliver it. I am authorizing this transfer now. Do you understand? I understand, Wells said. The envelope was transferred. It was picked up by a classified material courier service. It was transported to a secure facility in Arlington, Virginia. It was placed in a vault. It remained unopened, as it was supposed to remain unopened. As Marcus had understood, it should remain unopened, what the envelope contained. When it was finally opened in the secure facility in Arlington, was the names of 3 people. The 3 people whose lives depended on the extraction operation being successful. The 3 people whose vulnerability to American interests would only increase if their names became known, if their identities became compromised, if the operation became exposed. The names were not Marcus's concern. The names were not part of his responsibility. Marcus's responsibility was to ensure that the envelope made it to the United States, that it made it to the right hands, that it made it safely to people who had the clearance to know what it contained. Marcus had done this. The envelope had made it. The 3 people whose names were inside it were safe. The operation was secure. What Marcus did not know was that the envelope would become important for a different reason. What Marcus did not know was that the envelope would become evidence, not of the extraction operation, but of the fact that he had been carrying classified material when he came through the customs lanes. What Marcus did not know was that the envelope would be referenced in a statement that Arthur Grady would make, claiming that the sealed envelope was the reason he had sent Marcus to the general processing lane, that something about the way Marcus was carrying himself, and the way the duffel bag looked, and the way the soldier seemed suspicious, had made Arthur think that the envelope might be compromised. None of this was true, but none of this was yet visible in the narrative. What was visible was that Marcus Reeves had made it through customs, that he had made it through a secondary screening, that he had been approved by TSA, that he was now driving north on I-95, driving toward home, driving toward a 7-year-old girl who was waiting on the front porch of a house in upstate New York, eating cake and asking Mrs. Holt every few minutes if she could see the car coming yet. Marcus made it through the rental car process without incident. He paid cash. He provided his military ID. The clerk looked at his ID, looked at his face, looked at his military ID again. "Welcome home, sir," she said. Marcus nodded. He did not mention the incident at Lane 4. It had happened. It was over. He was moving forward. He drove north on I-95 in October morning light. The highway was full of the specific quality of October morning in the northeast. The angle of the sun was low and warm and caught the first turning leaves on the trees along the median. The radio was playing something he did not register. His hands were on the wheel. His mind was focused on the math. 4 hours to his house, 2 hours north of the time he was calling in. The timeline was tight. He had pulled over at a rest stop near New Haven to use the bathroom and to call Mrs. Patricia Holt, the neighbor who had agreed to watch Lily for the weekend while Marcus was in transit. Mrs. Holt was 73 years old, a retired teacher, a woman who had taken on the responsibility of caring for Lily for the duration of Marcus's deployment with the specific understanding that it mattered, that it was not just childcare, but a kind of trust that Marcus was placing in her. "Mrs. Holt, it's Marcus," he said when she picked up. "Oh, Marcus, thank goodness. Are you close? I'm about 2 hours away. 2.5, maybe. How is she?" "She's fine. She's been outside on the porch since about 6 this morning, watching for you. I gave her breakfast, and she's had some cake, that birthday cake you left instructions for me to make. I made it exactly how you said, vanilla with the strawberry filling." Marcus felt something in his chest tighten. He was thinking about Lily on the front porch in October morning, watching for a car, waiting for a father who had been gone for 3 months. "Mrs. Holt, she should be inside. The weather's going to turn cold later." "I know, but she insists she'll know when you're coming. She says she can feel it. Marcus, she's been very brave while you've been gone. But she misses you. She misses you a lot." Marcus did not say anything for a moment. He was looking out at the rest stop parking lot, at the cars coming and going, at the trucks pulling in to refuel, at the machinery of travel happening around him. "I'm coming as fast as I can," he said. "I'll be there in 2 hours. Can you make sure she eats something? Something more than cake? I'll make her eat. Don't worry. We'll be here waiting." Marcus hung up. He sat in the rental car for a few minutes. He was thinking about Lily on the front porch. He was thinking about the drawing in his duffel bag. He was thinking about all the moments that he had missed over the past 3 months, the birthdays in deployment, the milestones that had happened in a place whose name he could not say, to people who did not have the clearance to know it. He started the car. He drove back onto I-95. He drove north. But while Marcus was driving north, something else was happening. Something was being set in motion in the official machinery, in the bureaucracy of the Department of Customs and Border Protection, in the way that systems responded to complaints and allegations. At 1:30 p.m. on October 23rd, while Marcus was still driving, while he still had 3 hours left before reaching his house, the CBP regional office issued a directive. The directive was called an incident report. It was filed under the incident number CBP JFK 1023-20240-447. It was addressed to Officer Arthur Grady. It required Grady to appear in person at the CBP regional office at 6:00 a.m. on October 24th to provide a statement regarding his handling of SFC Marcus Reeves. Supervisor Roy Holler delivered the directive to Arthur Grady at the end of Grady's shift on October 23rd. Holler did not tell Grady what the complaint was about. Holler did not tell Grady who had filed the complaint. What Holler did tell Grady was, "There's been a complaint filed. It's routine. You go in tomorrow morning. You explain your actions, and we move on from there." Arthur Grady did not feel routine. Arthur Grady felt angry. Arthur Grady felt like he had been correct about something and that now he was being questioned about being correct. What Arthur Grady did not understand was that being correct and being discriminatory could be, in the specific situation he had created, the same thing. Arthur did not sleep that night. He sat in his apartment, a one-bedroom in Queens that he had lived in for 12 years. and he thought about what he would say. He thought about the way that Marcus had been dressed in civilian clothes when real military personnel wore their uniforms. He thought about the way that the duffel bag had looked like it had been through combat. He thought about the way that Marcus had seemed like he was hiding something. All of these thoughts were based on assumptions. All of these assumptions were based on things Arthur had learned to see through 15 years of working customs, which meant that Arthur believed they were true, which meant that Arthur would defend them. At 6 a.m. on October 24th, Arthur Grady walked into the CBP regional office. He walked into a conference room. He sat down across from a woman named Special Agent Diana Ruiz, who worked for the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Professional Responsibility. Diana Ruiz was 36 years old. She had investigated CBP officers for 5 years. She had seen patterns of discrimination. She had seen patterns of harassment. She had seen the specific ways that authority could be exercised unfairly. She was very good at her job. "Officer Grady," Diana said, "I need to understand your processing decision regarding SFC Marcus Reeves on October 23rd at approximately 3:20 a.m. in Lane 4. Can you walk me through what happened?" Arthur Grady walked through what happened. He described the man. The description included the word suspicious and the phrase something wasn't right. He described the military duffel bag. He described the civilian clothes. He described his decision to send Marcus to Lane 9. "What specifically was suspicious?" Diana asked. "The way he was dressed, the military bag, the way he was standing. I've worked these lanes for 15 years. I know when something isn't right." "Did you review his documents?" Diana asked. "I looked at them." "Did you process them?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I made a decision that general processing was more appropriate." "Did you believe that his documents were fraudulent?" Diana asked. "I didn't believe them. I had a feeling." "A feeling." Diana said this not as a question, but as a statement. She made a note. "Officer Grady, I have reviewed the surveillance footage of your interaction with SFC Reeves. I have also reviewed his documents, which were legitimate military papers, Title 10 orders, and appropriate credentials for a returning service member. Can you explain to me what specifically led you to believe that those documents were fraudulent?" Arthur Grady did not say anything because, Diana continued, "What I see in the surveillance footage is you refusing to process the documents of a service member based on his appearance. What I see is discrimination. What I see is a violation of CBP protocol. Do you understand?" "I was protecting the border," Arthur said. "You were profiling," Diana said. "You were making assumptions about a person based on how they looked, not based on their documents, not based on their credentials, not based on anything other than your gut feeling. And your gut feeling was wrong. SFC Reeves was who he said he was. His documents were legitimate. His materials were classified and were appropriately handled in secondary screening. What you did was inappropriate. Do you understand?" Arthur understood, but understanding and accepting were different things. Arthur sat in the conference room and listened to Diana explain what he had done and why it was wrong. And what Arthur understood was that Diana had an agenda, that she was trying to get him to say something that could be used against him, that the military was closing ranks against civilians. What Arthur did not understand was that his actions had put Marcus Reeves through a secondary screening process that had delayed him by 2 hours. What Arthur did not understand was that those 2 hours were now the distance between Marcus and his daughter. That Lily was waiting on a front porch, watching for a car that was now going to arrive 2 hours later than he had promised. Diana Ruiz made detailed notes of the interview. She documented every word that Arthur Grady said. She documented his justifications. She documented his insistence that he had done nothing wrong. She documented the pattern of his thinking, the way that assumption had replaced evidence, the way that his instinct was actually a learned response, learned from somewhere, from something, from the specific machinery of his own mind and experience. When the interview was over, Diana told Arthur that an investigation would be opened. She told him that he was suspended from active duty, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. She told him that he should not discuss this matter with anyone. She told him that he should expect a formal letter from the CBP regional office within 48 hours. Arthur Grady left the CBP regional office at 7:15 a.m. He did not go to work. He did not go home. He drove around Queens for a while, driving without destination, driving the way people drive when they have been told something they did not expect to hear, and they need to process it without being observed. What Arthur did not know was that the investigation was only beginning. What Arthur did not know was that the investigation would expand, that it would pull in other cases, that it would look at the pattern of Arthur's decisions over the past 5 years, that it would uncover the fact that Arthur Grady had dismissed 23 complaints filed against him by travelers who believed they had been treated unfairly. 23 complaints, all dismissed, all reviewed by Supervisor Roy Holler, all accepted as justified. What Arthur did not know was that his suspension was not the end of something. What Arthur did not know was that it was the beginning. At 2:45 p.m. on October 23rd, Marcus pulled off I-95 at the exit that led to his town, Reunite. He drove through town, past the post office, past the school, past the coffee shop where he had taken Lily for ice cream the previous summer. He drove onto Riverside Road. He was maybe 5 minutes from home. What he did not know was that Lily had been on the front porch since 6:00 a.m. What he did not know was that she had refused to come inside, had refused to go to school. It was a Friday, but she had a birthday party planned at school, and she had refused to go. Mrs. Holt had called and said, "Lily says her father will be home today and that she has to wait for him. I don't think she's going to move until he gets here." Marcus had been on the phone, still driving on I-95, when Mrs. Holt told him this. She should go to her birthday party, Marcus had said. "Tell her I'm sorry, but I want her to have a good birthday at school." But Lily had refused. Lily had had the specific certainty of a 7-year-old who understands something that adults have not quite figured out yet. Lily had understood that her father was coming home on her birthday, that today was the day, that if she waited on the front porch, she would be the first person to see him. So she had waited. She had put on a dress, a purple dress with flowers on it, the dress she had chosen for her birthday. Mrs. Holt had helped her do her hair. Mrs. Holt had given her breakfast, and then Lily had gone to the front porch, and she had sat down, and she had waited. By 1:00 p.m., she had eaten almost the entire birthday cake that Mrs. Holt had made by 1:30 p.m. The half-eaten cake was on the porch step beside her. By 2:30 p.m., she was very still, very focused. The way children are still when they are doing something that matters to them. She was watching for a car. When Marcus turned onto Riverside Road, he was 1 minute away. He did not know this yet. He was thinking about the drive, about the time, about the fact that he was now very close to home. His hands were tight on the wheel. His heart was moving faster than his body was driving. He turned the corner. He could see his house. It was a modest house, 2 stories, with a front porch and a backyard where Lily liked to play. The house had belonged to him for 6 years. It was the first house he had ever owned. It was home. and on the front porch, there was a small girl in a purple dress Marcus pulled into the driveway. He did not immediately get out of the car. He sat for a moment, taking in the specific image of his daughter sitting on the front porch of his house, waiting for him, the cake in front of her. The morning having turned into afternoon, having turned into this moment. Then he got out of the car. Lily looked up. For a moment, for just a moment, there was a look of verification on her face. The specific look of someone determining whether the car that had just pulled into the driveway contained the person she had been waiting for. Then she understood. She recognized something, his walk, his shape, something that was him and not anyone else. She ran. She hit him at chest height with the force of 7 years of accumulated absence. He took the impact and held on. His knee registered the landing, his left knee, which had been injured in his second deployment and which had never fully healed, and he did not care. The pain was so small compared to everything else. She smelled like birthday cake and strawberry shampoo. She smelled like home. She had been thinking about this smell for 3 months, but he had not known he was thinking about it. His mind had only just now told his body what it had been missing. "You're late," she said, into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," she said. "Mrs. Holt saved you cake." He pulled back to look at her. She looked at him, at the civilian clothes, at the tiredness in his face, at something she could not name but could see anyway. In her 7-year-old way, she was assessing him, determining if he was hurt, understanding what 3 months of deployment looked like when it was standing in front of you, not just something that was happening far away. "You look tired, Daddy," she said. "I am," he said, "but I'm home." What Marcus did not know, what would take him 4 hours to understand, was that while he was pulling into his driveway and Lily was running toward him and his arms were closing around his daughter, something was happening at JFK International Airport. Something was happening in the customs hall, in the secondary screening room, in the administrative offices where decisions about people were being made without their knowledge. An investigation had been opened. A complaint had been filed. The surveillance footage had been reviewed. The sequence of events at Lane 4 had been examined frame by frame, moment by moment, decision by decision. And at the center of that examination was the question of why Arthur Grady had done what he had done. Not whether Arthur had done it, that was clear, that was documented, that was visible in the footage. But why? What had driven the decision? What had made Arthur look at Marcus Reeves and see someone who needed to be sent to the general processing lane, rather than someone who needed to be processed according to the documents he was carrying? Diana Ruiz had access to everything. She had access to the surveillance footage. She had access to Arthur's statement. She had access to the interview transcript. She had access to the information about Marcus, the military records, the deployment information, the fact that Marcus had been returning from a classified extraction operation that was, in its broadest outlines, still classified but whose general parameters were known to people who needed to know them. What Diana Ruiz understood was that she was looking at a case of discrimination. What Diana Ruiz also understood was that discrimination, in its most insidious forms, hides behind language, the language of instinct, the language of professional judgment, the language of protecting the border. Diana Ruiz had read the literature on this. Diana Ruiz had done the training on unconscious bias. Diana Ruiz understood that the form of discrimination that was most difficult to prosecute was the form that the person engaging in it believed was justified. What Diana Ruiz did not know, yet, was that the case was about to expand. What Diana Ruiz did not know was that by the end of the day, on October 24th, she would have filed complaints for reopening 15 cases. 15 cases where travelers had filed complaints against Arthur Grady. Complaints that had been dismissed. Complaints that were now being reconsidered in light of the pattern that was emerging. Among those 15 cases was the case of a woman from Jamaica who had been detained for 7 hours on the suspicion of narcotics trafficking, despite submitting legitimate documentation. Among them was the case of a man from Nigeria who had been subjected to a secondary screening that lasted 4 hours. Despite presenting appropriate travel documents and a clear immigration status, among them was the case of a couple from Haiti who had been questioned about the authenticity of their marriage certificate. Despite producing a legal marriage license from the state of New York, all of these cases had been marked as completed. All of them had been marked as no violation found. All of them had been reviewed by Supervisor Roy Holler and approved as justified. But when Diana Ruiz looked at them in the light of what had happened with Marcus Reeves, they took on a different pattern. They became part of a constellation. They became evidence. But on October 23rd, in the afternoon, while Marcus was holding his daughter on his front porch, none of this was visible to him. What was visible to Marcus was Lily, the specific reality of her, the weight of her in his arms, the fact that he had made a promise and that he had kept it. They went inside. Mrs. Holt was waiting in the kitchen. She had made a simple dinner, chicken and vegetables and rice, the kind of food that Marcus had been thinking about for 3 months. Lily had cake, and Marcus had cake, and Mrs. Holt had cake. And they sat at the kitchen table, and Lily told him everything that had happened in the past 3 months while he was gone. She told him about school. She told him about the friends she had made. She told him about the drawing she had made for him, the astronaut in space, the one that he had carried with him in his duffel bag. She told him about asking Mrs. Holt every morning if he was coming home today. Every morning, Marcus asked. Every morning, Mrs. Holt confirmed. Rain or shine, she would ask me at breakfast. Lily nodded. She was eating cake very carefully, making sure not to get frosting on the purple dress. I knew you would come, she said. I knew it because you said you would, and you always come when you say you will. Marcus felt something break open in his chest. He was thinking about the past 3 months. He was thinking about the nights in the FOB when he could not sleep because he was thinking about his daughter. He was thinking about the morning he woke up and realized it was her birthday and that he might not make it in time. He was thinking about the moment when the final C-17 lifted off and he understood that he had made it, that he was going to make it, that the promise was going to be kept. I always will, he said. I promise. I will always come when I say I will. After dinner, after Mrs. Holt had gone home, after Lily had been put to bed, though she had resisted sleep, had wanted to stay awake with Marcus, had eventually fallen asleep on the couch next to him. Marcus had sat very still in his living room. He had the duffel bag in front of him. He took out the drawing. The drawing was still in perfect condition. The crayon was still bright. The astronaut was still standing in space, still reaching for the stars, still the exact product of his daughter's imagination 3 months ago. Below the astronaut, Lily had written her name, Lily, then in different colored crayon. Someone, maybe Mrs. Holt, maybe Lily had done it herself, had written Datey. Marcus held the drawing. He was very tired. He had been awake for more than 90 hours. His body was starting to register what his mind had known for days, that he needed to sleep. That rest was now possible, that the mission was complete, and he could finally allow himself to let go. But before he slept, he did something that would later become the most important moment of his testimony. He took the drawing from his breast pocket, the drawing that he had carried on his person for 72 hours, that he had placed in his pocket before boarding the C-17, that had been on his body when he came through the customs lanes at JFK, and he looked at it in the light of his living room lamp. He thought about picking it up from the holding room floor. He thought about the moment when the secondary screening had ended and he had been cleared to go. He thought about the fact that the drawing had never left his possession, that it had been in his pocket the entire time. He thought about what might have happened if the drawing had been something else, if it had been evidence of something, if it had been material that could have been used against him, if the sealed envelope at the bottom of his duffel bag had been something that someone wanted to find. He thought about how precarious it was. The drawing, the flag, the envelope, his body, his presence at the border. How easily it could all be different. How easily the decision at Lane 4 could have been different. How easily the secondary screening could have gone differently. How easily he might not be sitting in his living room holding a drawing from his daughter. He placed the drawing on the coffee table. He sat very still, and then, without allowing himself to think too much about it, he picked up his phone and called Captain Kowalski. Captain Kowalski answered the phone at 9:47 p.m. He was in his office at the forward operating base, preparing for the final drawdown operations. He had been expecting Marcus to call. "Reeves," Kowalski said. "You home?" "Yes, sir, I'm home. The envelope made it secondary screening, but it made it. The courier picked it up this morning." "Good. And Lily?" "She's fine. She was waiting for me on the front porch. She'd been waiting since 6 in the morning." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what matters. Don't think about the rest of it. You did your job. You got out. You're home. That's all that matters." But Marcus was thinking about the rest of it. Marcus was thinking about the moment at Lane 4, about the officer who had sent him to the general processing lane, about the understanding that had settled in his body during secondary screening that something was not right, that he had been treated differently, that his documents, the documents that were supposed to protect him, that were supposed to mark him as legitimate, had not been enough. "Sir," Marcus said, "there was an incident at the customs lane at JFK." Kowalski's voice changed. It became very sharp, very focused. "What kind of incident?" Marcus told him. He told him about Arthur Grady. He told him about Lane 4. He told him about the refusal to process his documents. He told him about being redirected to the general processing lane. There was a very long silence on the other end of the line. Then Kowalski said, "Did you report it?" "No, sir. I was processed in secondary. The TSA agent, Henderson, he was professional. He verified everything. I was cleared. I came home." "Did anything get lost? Anything compromised?" "No, sir. Everything was secure. The envelope made it. The flag made it. Everything's fine." "No," Kowalski said. "It's not fine. It's not fine at all. What you're describing is a violation of federal protocol. What you're describing is discrimination, and the fact that you didn't report it doesn't change what happened." "I didn't want to make trouble," Marcus said. "I'm home. Lily's here. That was the mission. Everything else is secondary," Kowalski finished. "No, not secondary. This matters. Let me make a call. Don't call anyone else about this. Let me see what we need to do." Kowalski hung up. Marcus sat in his living room. He was holding his phone. He was looking at his daughter sleeping on the couch. He was thinking about the moment at Lane 4, about the moment when Arthur Grady had made a decision about who he was based on appearance and assumption. What Marcus did not know was that Kowalski was already making calls. Kowalski was already in contact with the base JAG office. Kowalski was already documenting what had happened, was already triggering the chain of command that would eventually lead to Marcus's testimony, to his appearance before a tribunal, to the case that would consume the next 6 months of his life. What Marcus did not know was that keeping the record mattered. What Marcus did not know was that by the end of October, Carlos Mendez would be approached by Diana Ruiz, approached carefully, approached with the understanding that he was a witness and a potential threat, and someone who might be willing to document what he had seen. What Marcus did not know was that Carlos would hand over the blue notebook, that the notebook would become part of the federal record, that the 41 entries in the blue notebook would form the evidentiary basis for the pattern that Diana Ruiz was constructing. What Marcus did not know was that the evening he came home, the evening when he held his daughter, the evening when he sat in his living room and thought about the moment at Lane 4, was the beginning of something much larger than the moment itself. By the end of October 24th, the investigation had formally expanded. Diana Ruiz had filed a report with the CBP regional director outlining her findings. The report documented the incident at Lane 4. The report documented the pattern of complaints that had been dismissed. The report recommended that 17 cases be reopened for investigation. The report recommended that Supervisor Roy Holler be placed under administrative review. The report also recommended that charges be filed against Officer Arthur Grady for violations of civil rights protections, for abuse of authority, and for discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. What Diana Ruiz did not know, at the moment she filed the report, was that the case would expand far beyond the CBP. What Diana Ruiz did not know was that the Department of Justice would take an interest in the case, that the FBI would open a parallel investigation, that the case would eventually become a federal prosecution. But the machinery was in motion. The machinery was beginning to turn. At the CBP regional office, a copy of Diana Ruiz's report was placed on the desk of Regional Director James Carmichael. Carmichael was 56 years old, a 25-year veteran of the Border Patrol, a man who had built a career on the principle that protecting the border required clear thinking and fair treatment of all travelers. Carmichael read Diana's report. He read it twice. He understood what it meant. He called Roy Haller into his office. "Roy," Carmichael said, "I've read the report about Officer Grady. I've also read the note about your involvement in dismissing 23 complaints. We need to talk about what happened here." Roy Haller sat down. He was 61 years old. He had worked for the CBP for 28 years. He had never been the subject of an internal investigation. He did not like being the subject of an internal investigation. "Those complaints were frivolous," Haller said. "They were people upset about being screened thoroughly. That's not discrimination. That's doing the job. That's not what the evidence shows." Carmichael said, "The evidence shows a pattern. The evidence shows that Officer Grady made different decisions about different people based on how they looked, not based on their documents or their status. And the evidence shows that you reviewed those cases and accepted that pattern as justified." I need to understand why. Haller did not have a good answer. Haller had supervised Arthur Grady for 5 years. Haller had written commendations for Arthur Grady. Haller had recommended Arthur Grady for promotion. Haller had believed that Arthur Grady was a good officer, that Arthur's instincts were sound, that the complaints were just the normal friction of border security work. But Carmichael was not interested in Haller's belief. Carmichael was interested in facts. Carmichael was interested in evidence. Carmichael was interested in understanding how a pattern of discrimination had been allowed to continue for 5 years under Haller's supervision. You're on administrative review, effective immediately, Carmichael said. Your access to personnel decisions is suspended. A new supervisor will be assigned to your district. You will cooperate fully with Special Agent Ruiz's investigation. Do you understand? Roy Holler understood. Roy Holler left the office. Roy Holler went home. Roy Holler sat in his house and understood that his career was over, that the decision to protect Arthur Grady, the decision to approve his actions, the decision to accept his explanations had now become the thing that defined his professional legacy. While the investigation was expanding at JFK, while Diana Ruiz was opening files and compiling evidence, while Roy Holler was being placed on administrative review, Marcus Reeves was in his house. He was unpacking his duffel bag. He was putting clothes in the washing machine. He was moving through the specific rituals of returning home from deployment. The first thing he did was hang the flag. He found a frame in the garage, a simple wooden frame that had held a photograph once upon a time. The flag was still folded in its triangle. Marcus placed it in the frame. He hung it above the bookshelf in the living room. Lily woke up from her nap and found him standing in front of the flag. "Where's it from?" she asked. "Someone gave it to me," Marcus said. "Someone who was glad to get home." Lily considered this information with the seriousness of a 7-year-old. Then she went back to her cake. The drawing went on the refrigerator. Marcus placed it at eye level for Lily, at a height where she could see it every time she went to the kitchen. He found the magnet set that Mrs. Holt had bought, a set of letters and numbers, and he arranged the letters below the drawing. Lily arranged them. H-O-M-E, home. It was the first word she wanted to see every morning. It was the word that represented what had happened, what had been at stake, what had been kept safe. It was the word that Marcus had been thinking about for 72 hours, the word that had driven the logistics of the extraction, the word that meant his daughter had waited on a front porch and been right. 3 days after Marcus came home, Carlos Mendez received a phone call. The call came from a number he did not recognize. When he answered, a woman identified herself as Special Agent Diana Ruiz from the Department of Homeland Security. "Officer Mendez," Diana said. "I am investigating a matter related to CBP operations at Terminal 4 on October 23rd. I understand that you were working Lane 9 that morning. I would like to speak with you about what you observed." Carlos's heart accelerated. He understood, immediately, what Diana was asking him about. He understood that the blue notebook, the notebook that he had been keeping in his left breast pocket, the notebook that had 11 entries about Arthur Grady, was now about to become relevant to something much larger than his private documentation. "Yes," Carlos said. "Yes, I'll speak with you. I have some information that might be relevant." They arranged to meet that afternoon at the CBP regional office. When Carlos arrived, Diana Ruiz was waiting for him in a small conference room. Diana was professional, was clear, was asking very specific questions about what Carlos had observed at Lane 4, what he had seen Arthur Grady do, what he had understood about the reasoning for the decision. And then Diana asked the question that changed everything. "Have you documented any of your observations?" Carlos reached into his left breast pocket. He took out the blue notebook. He placed it on the table in front of Diana. "I started keeping a record," Carlos said. "After what I saw that morning, I wanted to make sure I remembered. I wanted to make sure there was documentation." Diana opened the notebook. She read through the entries. She read about the dates and times. She read about the patterns. She read about the systematic nature of what Arthur Grady had been doing, the repetition of it, the way that the same decision had been made over and over again about different people. When Diana finished reading, she looked up at Carlos. "How long have you been keeping this?" she asked. "Since October 23rd, Carlos said. "Since the morning that Sergeant Reeves came through. I have 43 entries now. I add to it every time I observe something that seems wrong." "Can I take this?" Diana asked. "I need this for the investigation." "Yes," Carlos said. "Yes, take it. That's why I wrote it. I wanted there to be a record." Diana placed the blue notebook in an evidence bag. She explained to Carlos that his documentation would be critical to the investigation, that he had done the right thing by keeping track, that his actions had made a significant difference. What Carlos did not fully understand, in that moment, was the weight of what he had done. What Carlos would come to understand later was that the blue notebook would become the foundation of the federal investigation. What Carlos would come to understand was that by keeping the record, by documenting the pattern, by refusing to let the incidents disappear into the machinery of bureaucracy, he had made it possible for Diana Ruiz to build a case that extended beyond a single incident and into a pattern that had consequences. In the first week of November, Marcus was formally interviewed. The interview took place in an office in Lower Manhattan, in a federal building, in a room that had been designated for sensitive matters. The interview was conducted by Special Agent Douglas Wells, the FBI representative who had been involved in the envelope transfer, and by Diana Ruiz from DHS. Marcus came with a lawyer, a JAG officer named Captain Sarah Chen, who had been assigned to represent him. Chen had reviewed the facts of the case. Chen understood what had happened. Chen understood that Marcus was not being accused of anything, that Marcus was a witness, that Marcus's testimony was critical to establishing what Diana Ruiz believed she could prove. "Sergeant Reeves," Diana said, "I want to thank you for coming in. I know this is not how you wanted to spend your first week home." "It's necessary," Marcus said. "What happened shouldn't have happened." Diana walked Marcus through the events at Lane 4. She had him describe what Arthur had said, what Marcus had felt, how the interaction had proceeded. She had him explain his decision to move to Lane 9 without arguing, without escalating, without making the moment into something larger than it was. "Why didn't you escalate?" Diana asked. "Why didn't you demand to speak to a supervisor? Why didn't you question the officer's authority?" Marcus took a moment to answer. When he did, his voice was steady, measured, informed by a deep understanding of how authority works in systems. "Because I'm a black man standing in a customs lane at 4 a.m, Marcus said. "I'm tired. I've been awake for 72 hours. I have classified material in my bag. The officer has authority. Escalating doesn't help. It makes things worse. So I complied. I went to the other lane. I got processed. I came home. That's the calculation I made," Diana nodded. She made a note. She understood what Marcus was saying. She understood that the decision to comply had been born of experience, of understanding how systems work, of the specific weight that comes with being perceived as a threat in a space where the person in authority has the power to detain you, to investigate you, to make your life difficult. "Did you consider filing a complaint?" Diana asked. "I considered it," Marcus said. "And then I decided that what I wanted was to get home to my daughter. The complaint seemed secondary to that." "It's not secondary," Diana said. "What happened to you is exactly why this investigation is necessary. Because if it's allowed to continue, if it's not addressed, if it's accepted as normal, then it happens again and again and again." The interview lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Diana had what she needed. She had Marcus's testimony. She had his account of what happened. She had his understanding of the impact of the moment. When Marcus left the federal building, Captain Chen walked him to the street. The autumn afternoon was cold. The light was the specific gray of November in New York. "You did good," Chen said. "Your testimony was clear. It matters." "When will the case move forward?" Marcus asked. "That depends on the investigation." Chen said, "Diana Ruiz is building a pattern. She's compiling evidence. When she's ready, when she believes she has what she needs, she'll recommend charges. Then it goes to the Department of Justice. Then it becomes a federal case." Marcus understood. Marcus had experience with the machinery of military justice. Marcus understood that what happened at Lane 4 would be processed through a system, would become a case number, would be compiled into a file that would be reviewed by people he would never meet. But while Marcus was walking back to his car, while he was driving north toward his house and his daughter, the machinery was moving in another direction. Diana Ruiz was compiling her evidence. Diana Ruiz was creating a narrative that connected all of the pieces. Arthur Grady's decision at Lane 4. The pattern documented in Carlos Mendez's blue notebook. The 23 dismissed complaints. The expansion of the investigation to 41 cases. The archive of surveillance footage that showed the pattern playing out again and again. By the end of November, Diana Ruiz had completed her preliminary investigation. She had submitted her report to the CBP regional director and to the FBI. The report was comprehensive. The report was damning. The report documented the systematic nature of what Arthur Grady had been doing, the way that his decisions had consistently disadvantaged certain types of travelers, travelers of color, travelers from countries in the Middle East, travelers who came from backgrounds that Arthur Grady had been trained, consciously or unconsciously, to view as suspicious. The report was forwarded to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice reviewed the report. The Department of Justice understood that what Diana Ruiz had documented was not just an individual instance of discrimination. What the Department of Justice understood was that the case represented a systematic failure in the CBP's oversight mechanisms, a pattern that had been allowed to continue under the supervision of an officer who should have intervened. By early December, the Department of Justice had made a decision. The Department of Justice was going to prosecute. The Department of Justice was going to bring charges against Officer Arthur Grady for violations of the Civil Rights Act, for abuse of authority under color of law, and for discrimination. Arthur Grady received notice of the charges in a letter dated December 5th. The letter was delivered to his address in Queens. The letter explained that he was being prosecuted by the United States of America. The letter explained the charges. The letter informed him that he had the right to legal counsel and that he would be expected to appear in federal court on December 19th. Arthur read the letter. He read it again. He did not call a lawyer immediately. What Arthur did first was sit in his apartment and think about what had happened. Think about the moment at Lane 4. Think about the decision that had seemed so justified at the time. He thought about Marcus Reeves. He thought about the fact that he had been right about something. Marcus was a soldier. Marcus was carrying military material. Marcus was coming from somewhere overseas. What Arthur did not think about was the fact that these facts did not justify his decision. What Arthur did not think about was the fact that Marcus had legitimate documents, that Marcus had legitimate status, that the only thing that was wrong was Arthur's decision to treat Marcus differently based on appearance. Arthur called a lawyer. The lawyer was a private attorney named Richard Williamson, who had experience with federal cases. Williamson listened to Arthur's account of what happened. Williamson looked at the evidence that was being compiled against Arthur. Williamson understood that what Arthur was facing was a significant legal problem. "The evidence is strong," Williamson told Arthur. They have surveillance footage. They have testimony from other officers. They have documentation of a pattern. Your best option is to try to negotiate a plea. Going to trial would be expensive and would likely not result in a favorable outcome. Arthur did not immediately accept this advice. Arthur wanted to fight. Arthur wanted to argue that his decision was justified, that his instinct was sound, that he had not done anything wrong. But the more that Arthur's lawyer explained what the evidence showed, the more Arthur began to understand the weight of what he was facing. In the week before the trial was scheduled to begin, Marcus was called to testify. The trial was not just about Arthur Grady anymore. The trial was about the system that had allowed Arthur Grady to continue making discriminatory decisions for 5 years. The trial was about Supervisor Roy Holler, who had reviewed the complaints and dismissed them. The trial was about the machinery of the CBP that had treated discrimination as an acceptable cost of doing business. Marcus drove down to New York. He stayed at a hotel provided by the federal government. He was given a schedule of when he would testify. He was given a briefing by the Department of Justice attorney who would be trying the case, a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Diaz, who had spent 15 years prosecuting civil rights violations. "Your testimony is critical," Diaz told Marcus. "You're the incident that started everything. Your story is the human story that ties all of the evidence together." Marcus understood. Marcus had not wanted to become the center of a federal case. Marcus had wanted to come home, be with his daughter, move forward. But the case had happened anyway, and now his testimony was necessary. And so Marcus would testify. The night before he testified, Marcus sat in his hotel room and thought about what he was going to say. He thought about the moment at Lane 4. He thought about the way that Arthur had looked at him and seen something that was not there, or more precisely, had seen something that was there. Marcus's appearance, Marcus's race, and had decided that these facts were sufficient to override the documents that Marcus was carrying. He thought about the 72 hours that had preceded the moment at Lane 4. He thought about the mortar fire. He thought about Elena Ortega and Diego and the stuffed bear on the tarmac. He thought about the fact that he had been awake for 72 hours and had kept moving, had kept people safe, had carried an ambassador's flag and his daughter's drawing and a sealed envelope. He thought about the fact that after all of that, after 72 hours of operation under fire, after the successful extraction of 47 people, after the safe transport of classified material, the first moment of friction he encountered was not in Tehran, but in his own country, in his own customs lanes, at the hands of someone who had decided in the span of 2 seconds that something about him was wrong. He thought about what he was going to say when he testified. He decided that he would tell the truth. He would tell the truth about what happened. He would tell the truth about what he felt. He would tell the truth about what he understood in that moment, about what it meant to be a man of color standing in a customs lane being questioned by someone in authority. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan is a building made of granite and glass, a building that has been the site of significant trials, a building where the weight of the judicial system becomes visible in the architecture. Marcus walked into that building on the morning of December 19th. He was wearing the uniform he had not been allowed to wear at the airport. He was wearing the rank insignia he had stripped off in a forward operating base 48 hours before arriving at JFK. He was wearing his service record on his sleeve. He was met by AUSA Rebecca Diaz. Diaz had prepared him for testimony, but this was the first moment when Marcus truly understood what was about to happen. This was the moment when the testimony became real, when the case became tangible, when his account of what had happened was about to become part of the official record of the United States of America. You understand what you're about to do? Diaz asked. I'm going to tell the truth, Marcus said, about what happened. That's all I need, Diaz said. Just tell the truth. The rest will follow. The courtroom was not as full as Marcus had expected. There were reporters. There were observers from civil rights organizations. There were lawyers from the Department of Justice. There was Arthur Grady, sitting at the defense table with his attorney, Richard Williamson. There was a jury. 12 people who had been selected for their ability to judge the case on its merits. 12 people who understood that they were about to make a decision about what had happened at Lane 4. Marcus was sworn in. He placed his hand on the Bible. He said the words, "I do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." And then he sat down, and he began to tell what had happened. AUSA Diaz walked him through the events at Lane 4. She had him describe his arrival at JFK. She had him describe his presentation of his documents. She had him describe the moment when Arthur Grady had refused to process those documents. She had him describe the words that Arthur had used. "I don't believe you. Lane 9 is where you need to be. Something wasn't right about that guy." And then Diaz asked him the question that would define his testimony. Sergeant Reeves, "Had you done anything to indicate that your documents were fraudulent? Had you indicated any suspicious behavior? Had you done anything that would justify being sent to the general processing lane?" Marcus looked directly at the jury. He looked at each person. He understood that he was speaking to them, that his answer mattered to them, that his truthfulness would either convince them or fail to convince them. "No," he said. "I had done nothing wrong. My documents were legitimate. My status was legitimate. I was a soldier coming home from a classified deployment. That should have been enough. But it wasn't enough, was it?" Diaz asked. "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't." "Why do you think that was?" Diaz asked. Marcus took a moment. He was being asked to explain the mechanism of discrimination, to articulate the invisible thing that Arthur Grady had felt and acted on. He was being asked to name it in a way that would be credible to the jury. That would be understandable. That would move them. "Because I'm black," Marcus said. Officer Grady looked at me and saw something that made him suspicious. But it wasn't anything I had done. It was what he saw when he looked at my face. He made a decision based on that. And that decision meant that instead of being processed as a service member, I was processed as a suspected violator. That's what happened. The courtroom was silent. The jury was silent. Arthur Grady was looking at the table in front of him, not looking at Marcus, not making eye contact with the man whose life was now being described in a federal courtroom. The cross-examination came next. Richard Williamson, Arthur's attorney, stood up. Williamson was in a difficult position. Williamson's client had been caught on surveillance footage making a discriminatory decision. Williamson's client had made a statement that provided no justification for that decision. Williamson's defense was weak, but Williamson tried anyway. Williamson asked Marcus about the duffel bag. Williamson asked Marcus about the fact that he had not been wearing a military uniform. Williamson asked Marcus whether Marcus understood that customs officers were supposed to be cautious, were supposed to screen people thoroughly, were supposed to protect the border, and to each question, Marcus answered with clarity. "I was traveling under orders not to wear my uniform. The duffel bag is standard military issue. And yes, I understand that border security is important, but border security does not justify discrimination." The testimony lasted 6 hours. When Marcus was finally released from the stand, when he was finally able to walk out of the courtroom, he felt emptied of something. As if the act of telling the truth had extracted something from him that could not be replaced. After Marcus testified, other witnesses testified, Carlos Mendez testified about what he had observed at Lane 4. Carlos testified about the blue notebook. Carlos testified about the pattern of Arthur Grady's decisions. Carlos testified about the systematic nature of what had been happening, the way that Arthur had been treating travelers differently based on their appearance. Officer Henderson, the TSA agent, testified about the secondary screening. Henderson testified about the drawing, about understanding what it represented, about the understanding that Marcus was not a threat, but a soldier coming home. Diana Ruiz testified about the investigation. Diana presented the surveillance footage. Diana presented the data. Diana presented the pattern. Diana explained to the jury that what they were looking at was not an isolated incident, but a systematic approach to screening that had consistently disadvantaged certain types of travelers. And then came the evidence about Supervisor Roy Haller. The evidence showed that Haller had received 23 complaints about Arthur Grady. The evidence showed that Haller had dismissed all 23 complaints. The evidence showed that Haller had written memo approving Arthur's actions. Memo that stated that Arthur's decision-making was sound, that Arthur's instincts were trustworthy. This evidence made the case more than just about Arthur Grady. This evidence made the case about a system that had failed, about the machinery of oversight that had been compromised, about the understanding that discrimination had not been an aberration, but had been treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. By the end of the first week of testimony, it was clear which way the case was moving. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was visible. The jury was not going to have a difficult decision to make. Arthur Grady took the stand on December 28th. It was the last day of the year's work before the Christmas break. The last moment before the trial would be suspended for 2 weeks and then resume in January. Arthur took the stand and he tried to explain himself. He explained that he had been concerned about the way Marcus was dressed. He explained that he had been concerned about the duffel bag. He explained that he had made a decision to send Marcus to the general processing lane because he wanted to ensure that the appropriate level of screening was being conducted. "I wasn't trying to discriminate," Arthur said. "I was trying to do my job. I was trying to protect the border." But the jury was not convinced. The jury had heard the surveillance footage. The jury had heard Marcus's testimony. The jury had heard the evidence about the 23 dismissed complaints. The jury had heard about the blue notebook. The jury had heard about the pattern. The jury understood that protecting the border did not require discrimination. The jury understood that legitimate security and fair treatment were not mutually exclusive. The jury understood that what Arthur had done was wrong, and that the system that had allowed Arthur to continue doing it was also wrong. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The deliberation took place in a room without windows, under the fluorescent lights that converted everything into the same flat gray as the customs hall at JFK. 12 people sat around a table and tried to determine what had happened, what it meant, whether it was illegal. The jury looked at the surveillance footage. The jury looked at the evidence. The jury considered the testimony. And by the end of 4 days, the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. On January 8th, the jury returned to the courtroom. The judge asked the foreperson for the verdict. The foreperson stood. The foreperson read the verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Arthur Grady was found guilty of violating civil rights protections under the Civil Rights Act. Arthur Grady was found guilty of abuse of authority under color of law. Arthur Grady was found guilty of discrimination. The courtroom was silent. Marcus was in the gallery, watching. Having been present for the final days of testimony, Marcus watched Arthur Grady being convicted. Marcus understood what it meant, not that the system had been made fair, not that discrimination had been eliminated, but that, in this moment, in this case, the system had functioned. The system had recognized discrimination. The system had held someone accountable. Sentencing was scheduled for February 14th, Valentine's Day, which seemed to carry its own irony, though no one mentioned it. Arthur Grady was brought to the courthouse. The judge was a woman named Judge Helen Torres, who had been on the federal bench for 12 years and who had a record of taking civil rights violations seriously. The prosecution presented arguments for sentencing. The prosecution recommended a sentence of 3 years in federal prison. The prosecution argued that Arthur Grady's actions had violated the rights of a soldier, had violated the integrity of the border screening process, had created a pattern of discrimination that had affected dozens of people. The defense presented arguments for leniency. The defense argued that Arthur Grady had no prior criminal history, that Arthur Grady had been trying to do his job, that Arthur Grady's actions, while wrong, did not warrant a significant prison sentence. Judge Torres listened to both arguments. Then she asked if Arthur Grady had anything to say. Arthur Grady stood. Arthur said that he was sorry for what had happened, that he had not intended to discriminate, that he had been trying to do his job the best way he knew how. But Arthur's apology did not ring true, did not carry the weight of genuine remorse, because Arthur had never actually acknowledged the thing that he had done, had never named the discrimination, had never said the words that would indicate he understood what he had been convicted of. Judge Torres sentenced Arthur Grady to 3 years in federal prison. Judge Torres also recommended that Arthur Grady be removed from any federal position for life, that Arthur Grady be required to pay restitution to the complainants in the reopened cases, that Arthur Grady's record be made part of the permanent archive of cases prosecuted for civil rights violations. When the sentencing was announced, Marcus did not feel satisfaction. Marcus did not feel vindication. What Marcus felt was a kind of completion, not an ending, not a resolution that erased what had happened, but a moment where the system had processed what had happened and had issued a judgment. The judgment was that Arthur Grady was wrong, that his actions had been discriminatory, that those actions had consequences. But the larger system, the system that had allowed Arthur Grady to make discriminatory decisions for 5 years, the system that had allowed Roy Haller to dismiss complaints without investigation, the system that had treated discrimination as an acceptable cost of doing business, that system remained. That system would have to change. But the change would not come from this case. The change would have to come from somewhere else, from someone else, from the understanding that what happened at Lane 4 was not an aberration, but was part of a larger pattern that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single customs lane at a single airport. Roy Haller's administrative review took 3 months. The review examined the 15 cases that Roy had dismissed. The review examined the memos that Roy had written approving Arthur's actions. The review examined the pattern of Roy's decisions, the pattern of Roy prioritizing throughput over fairness, the pattern of Roy treating complaints as friction rather than as signals of something wrong. The review concluded that Roy Haller had violated CBP protocols. The review concluded that Roy Haller had failed in his supervisory responsibilities. The review concluded that Roy Haller should be removed from his position. Roy Haller was notified of the decision in a letter dated March 18th. The letter stated that Roy Haller was being terminated from his position as supervisor, effective immediately. The letter stated that Roy's pension would be reduced due to the disciplinary action. The letter stated that Roy would be barred from working for the federal government for a period of 5 years. Roy Haller read the letter. Roy understood that his career was over, that the decision to protect Arthur Grady, to dismiss the complaints, to treat discrimination as acceptable, had now become the thing that defined his professional legacy. He called his wife. He told her that he was being terminated. He told her that they would need to tighten their budget, that his pension was being reduced, that he would be looking for work in the private sector. His wife asked if he was okay. Roy said that he was fine, that it would be fine, that they would make it work. But Roy was not fine. Roy was thinking about the 23 complaints that he had dismissed. Roy was thinking about the people who had filed those complaints. Roy was thinking about what those people's experiences had been like, what it had felt like to be treated unfairly by an officer who had been empowered to make decisions about them, and then to have the complaint dismissed by a supervisor who should have investigated, but who had chosen not to. Roy was not fine, but Roy would move forward. That was what people did. They moved forward. 3 months after Arthur Grady was sentenced, Carlos Mendez was offered a promotion. The promotion came through the normal channels. The CBP noticed his work, noticed his attention to detail, noticed the fact that he had been instrumental in documenting the pattern that led to the prosecution of Arthur Grady. Carlos was offered the position of training coordinator for the CBP regional office. The position involved teaching new customs officers about protocols, about civil rights protections, about the difference between legitimate security screening and discrimination. The position involved helping to rebuild the culture of the CBP, to help shift from a model where throughput and instinct drove decision-making to a model where documentation and fairness were prioritized. Carlos accepted the position. He took the blue notebook with him. The blue notebook was now part of the Federal Archive. The blue notebook had become Exhibit A in the case of the United States v. Arthur Grady. The blue notebook had become evidence of the possibility of keeping a record, of the importance of bearing witness, of the power of documentation to make visible what had previously been hidden. Carlos Mendez kept a new notebook now. The new notebook documented the training sessions he was conducting, the feedback he was receiving from the officers he was training, the slow, incremental process of trying to change a culture that had been built on instinct and assumption for far too long. 3 months after Arthur Grady was convicted, the Department of State closed the classified operation that had required the evacuation from Tehran. The operation had been successful. The 3 people whose names had been sealed in the envelope, whose lives had depended on the extraction operation, were now safe. They had been resettled. They had been given new identities. They had been given the opportunity to rebuild their lives in places where they would not be at risk, because they had chosen to help American interests. Marcus did not know their names. Marcus was not supposed to know their names. But Marcus knew that the sealed envelope that he had carried through the customs lanes at JFK had contained their names, had contained their freedom, had contained the stakes of the 72 hours that he had lived through. 3 names, 3 lives, 3 people who had made themselves vulnerable to American interests and who had been kept safe because Marcus had done his job, because he had kept people moving through fire, because he had understood that the mission was bigger than his own exhaustion. The Department of State sent Marcus a letter. The letter was marked official use only. The letter stated that the 3 individuals had been successfully resettled and that they were safe. The letter did not provide their names. The letter did not provide any identifying information. But the letter stated that the individuals had requested that Marcus Reeves know that they understood what he had done, that they understood that he had kept them safe, that they were grateful. Marcus read the letter. He did not cry. He had trained himself a long time ago not to cry in response to operational outcomes, but he read the letter, and he understood that the mission had been successful, that the people he had been responsible for had made it, that the envelope he had carried was no longer empty, was no longer a question, was now a completed action. By the spring of 2025, 6 months after Marcus had come home, the case was closed. The appeals process would take years. Richard Williamson was already working on arguments for appeal, was already working on challenging the conviction, but the trial itself was over. The jury had spoken. The verdict had been issued. Arthur Grady was in federal custody. The case was complete, but the larger work was just beginning. The CBP was implementing new protocols. The CBP was conducting mandatory training on civil rights protections. The CBP was reviewing all cases where complaints had been dismissed in the past 10 years. The CBP was trying to rebuild its culture, trying to shift from a model of instinct and assumption to a model of documentation and fairness. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that happened behind the scenes, in the machinery of bureaucracy, in the places where policies were written and procedures were revised and training materials were developed. It was not dramatic work. It was not the kind of work that made news or that inspired people, but it was the work that determined, over time, whether something had changed or whether everything would just return to the way it had been. Marcus was not involved in this work. Marcus was a witness who had testified, who had told the truth, who had participated in the system in the way that the system required. Marcus had done his duty. Now Marcus had to move on. In February of 2025, 4 months after the jury had rendered its verdict, a federal appeals court heard arguments about the case. The appeals court was asked to consider whether the conviction of Arthur Grady was appropriate, whether the evidence had supported the verdict, whether the sentence was just. The appeals court considered these questions. The appeals court looked at the evidence. The appeals court looked at the testimony. The appeals court listened to the arguments from both sides. And the appeals court, in a unanimous decision, affirmed the conviction. The appeals court stated that the evidence was overwhelming, that the jury had reached the correct conclusion, that Arthur Grady's actions had constituted discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. The appeals court did not overturn the sentence. The appeals court did not reduce the conviction. The appeals court affirmed everything: the guilty verdict, the 3-year prison sentence, the permanent removal from federal service. Arthur Grady could appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court receives thousands of petitions for certiorari every year and accepts only a small fraction. The Supreme Court was unlikely to accept the case. It was more likely that Arthur Grady would serve his sentence, would spend 3 years in federal prison, and would emerge to a world where his conviction was a matter of public record, where his name was associated with discrimination, where everything he had built over his career had been erased. The case was closed. The legal machinery had processed it. The verdict was final. In May of 2025, the final case in the reopened complaints was resolved. One of the complainants, the man from Nigeria who had been detained for 4 hours on the suspicion of narcotics trafficking, had filed a civil suit against the CBP for discrimination and false detention. The suit had asked for damages. The suit had asked for compensation for the time he had spent in detention, for the distress he had experienced, for the violation of his rights. The CBP, understanding that the case was unwinnable, understanding that the evidence was overwhelming, understanding that the optics of fighting the case would be worse than settling it, chose to settle. The settlement involved a payment of $250,000 to the complainant, an official apology from the CBP regional director, and a commitment to implement additional training and oversight. When the settlement was announced, it was included in a press release from the CBP. The press release mentioned Arthur Grady by name. The press release mentioned the investigation that had led to his conviction. The press release mentioned the pattern that had been discovered, the systematic nature of his discriminatory decisions, the pattern that had extended over 5 years, the 15 cases that had been reopened. Arthur Grady's name was in the press release. Arthur Grady's name was now permanently associated with discrimination, with the violation of civil rights, with the case that had forced the CBP to confront what it had been allowing to happen. In the federal prison where Arthur Grady was incarcerated, in the minimum security facility in upstate New York where he had been assigned. Arthur Grady learned about the settlement and the press release. He read his name in the official documents. He understood that his conviction had not ended the matter, but had instead opened it up, had instead forced the system to reckon with what he had been doing, had instead made his name synonymous with discrimination. Arthur had imagined, during his trial, that conviction would be the worst moment, that once the jury had spoken, once the verdict had been issued, the matter would be behind him. But conviction was not the worst moment. The worst moment was understanding that his actions had opened a door that could not be closed, that had forced the system to change, that had made it impossible to go back to the way things had been.